I want to take a little bit of time to talk about nitrogen in particular, its role in limiting forest productivity, and use this to talk about the importance of soil microorganisms in controlling its availability. I love forest fungi. They're a topic of great interest to me. Um, I don't want to only talk about them just because I like them. They're very relevant to us in understanding understanding how forests cycle nutrients, how trees themselves mitigate the overall lack of or limitation of nutrients, lack of nutrients in the environment. Um, Trees partner with microbes in order to facilitate uptake of many soil nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, I want to distinguish here. We're not talking about decomposition per se. We're actually talking about absorption, frequently talking about absorption. Many of these organisms are somewhat familiar. Many of the mushrooms that you will find in autumn in forest stands are actually the mycorrhizal symbionts, organisms that are living within and outside of roots that facilitate the uptake of critical nutrients and also help with uptake of water. Now, one thing to emphasize first off, again, is that some species cannot persist without their symbionts. And pines in particular, if they don't have these symbionts, they simply do not persist. Here's an example from the southern hemisphere. This is Monterey pine stand, and Monterey pine is the most important timber species in the southern hemisphere. South Africa, Australia, Argentina, and Chile, and New Zealand. However, the initial introductions of Monterey pine absolutely failed because plantings were done with seeds. And they were done in places where their symbionts did not occur. And because of that, they totally failed. And the cultivation of pines in the southern hemisphere was not successful until they were planted out in pots because the inoculum was present in the soil of those pots. So the photograph here of the mushroom is Amanita muscaria, which is a pretty common mushroom in California. It's really pretty mushroom. It's otherwise not very remarkable in the sense that it's not very rare. It's a remarkable mushroom, but it's not very it's pretty common. But in New Zealand, this is an exotic species, and it's essential for the timber industry there, and it's also essential for facilitating Monterey pine's invasion into native communities, which is not that great of a thing. I want to just show you one example of how nitrogen, or just prove to you empirically that nitrogen is important. Nitrogen turnover in forest soils is associated with productivity. So the more turnover that occurs in general, the higher above ground productivity. Don't just take my word for it. This has actually been measured. So why does that happen? Well, adding nitrogen to plants makes photosynthesis more efficient. Nitrogen is critical part of it controls or affects or is partially controls rubisco carboxylation. So that's a rate that plants can pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. And other aspects of photosynthesis are also controlled by foliar nitrogen availability. Now, we can change foliar nitrogen availability by adding nitrogen. Essentially makes plants more productive, makes photosynthesis happen in a more rapid way. That's why you can add nitrogen to a wheat or a cornfield and you increase yield. It works. It drives up photosynthesis rates. We can do the same in forests. It's just not always necessary, or it may not be worth the expense. Okay, so nitrogen comes from some other sources. Many organisms consume organic matter, and whether they're consuming other animals or whether they're consuming plants, the process of eating and pooping partially breaks down these materials and makes them more bioavailable. So does death. And animal carcasses, particularly large animal carcasses, as seen here. These are some deer that got caught in an avalanche in Shepherd's Pass in the High Sierra. These carcasses are potential nutrients that will facilitate growth in the future. Most of this kind of animal-derived nutrient comes from insects. Their carcasses are more uniformly distributed in forests, and sometimes it can be quite numerous. And it can be shown that nitrogen inputs sometimes are related to the dynamics of insect populations, and that's what you're seeing there on the right. Here's just a kind of a little bit of an off-the-wall example of how important soil microbes are for facilitating productivity and how much we still don't know about it. Anthrax is a very important disease that controls wildlife populations in Africa. Also, as it turns out, anthrax itself, and not just the creation of carcasses, but the microorganism itself appears to facilitate productivity of grasses. This was a really neat study that was done by Holly Gans a couple years back, where they added blood, I believe it was zebra blood, to the soil, and then also added anthrax spores in blood, and then areas where they just had spores, and so on and so forth. And what they were able to show, against what everyone expected that the blood and the carcass would increase productivity in these areas, but they actually showed that blood didn't matter that much. The carcass is more than just blood, so it probably is facilitating productivity. But what they were able to show is that just by adding anthrax spores, grass productivity increased. And I kind of point this out just to acknowledge that there's just a lot that we need to understand that we don't understand about how soil microbes influence nitrogen productivity. I mean, this is a pathogen of vertebrates. It's a powerful pathogen of vertebrates, and one would just not expect it to facilitate plant productivity, and we don't understand why this occurs. We can just see that it does. And of course, increasing the grass productivity in this system is going to increase the likelihood of transmission to large animals, these herbivores, and then perpetuate the disease cycle. So it makes evolutionary sense. We just don't know what's happening below ground here. Okay, and just wrapping this up, can we manipulate soil, and can we manipulate stand conditions? We can do both. And if you have the duty of managing a forest, you need to ask yourself what you're going for, and also what are the primary limitations that you are facing. If they are water and you absolutely need to increase productivity, well, then you may have to add water somehow. It's a lot easier to add something like nitrogen, but it may not be worth it. It may not actually pay off in the end. Most of the time, we thin stands because competition for light ends up being the most important and easiest to manipulate factor within forest stands. We get to lots of other benefits with it, such as reducing fuels, and reducing competition, of course, can reduce competition for water and nutrients as well.